During the special couples party, I saw my wife leaving with another man through the back doors, and it wasn't like a nightmare, because in nightmares, you wake up sweating, shaking, and realize everything is fine. But there was no alarm clock, no pillow, no escape. Just the dry, throbbing pain that gripped my chest like a cold blade. I ran to them without thinking, and when she saw me, she showed no surprise, didn't try to hide it, didn't have any words. She just lowered her eyes as if she already knew she was losing. And I didn't scream. I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't beg, I didn't plead. I just said, "You just walked out of our story." I walked back to the dining room alone, smiling at the waitress who offered me a glass of wine, as if my world wasn't crumbling inside. I didn't shed a tear. Not that it didn't hurt, it hurt so much that even breathing was a challenge. But I refused to be destroyed there, in front of everyone, in front of her. Because dignity isn't what's left when it's all over. It's what you choose to carry with you when love ends. That night, the music continued playing. Candlelight still flickered on the tables decorated with white flowers. The couples still laughed, still danced, still toasted love. And I, between slow sips of wine, toasted the end. She left through the back doors, but it wasn't just the ballroom she left. She left our home. She left the life we'd built. She left the promises she once made to me, looking into my eyes, her hands clasped in mine. And I, though shattered, knew right then and there was no going back. Betrayal, when it happens, doesn't just destroy love. It rips apart the floor, the ceiling, and even the mirror, because you look at yourself and no longer recognize yourself. The betrayed man shatters into 1,000 pieces and must decide what to do with them. I chose not to pick up the old pieces. I chose to rebuild myself differently. In the days that followed, I relived the scene dozens of times. In the shower, while driving, while chopping vegetables for a solitary dinner, while trying to sleep. Always her, in the red dress, her back bare, following a man I'd never seen. Always her, without the courage to look me in the eye, as if she already knew what she'd done, as if she'd accepted the sentence. I wondered what had happened to us. At what point had she disconnected from our story? If it was something I failed to do, or something she'd come to desire. But the truth is, betrayal doesn't come with justification. It comes with silence. With distances that become abysses. With gazes that no longer meet. And perhaps we were already two strangers sharing a roof even before that party. But it was in that moment that I realized, we had died. And she was the gravedigger. There was no fight. There was no scandal. Just a bitter goodbye, tinged with shame and regret. No words exchanged, no letters, no requests. She disappeared for weeks. Disappeared from our routine. Leaving only her shadow on the pillow beside us and a vague scent on the clothes left in the closet. And I, meanwhile, learned to love myself alone. I learned to make coffee for just one person. I learned not to blame myself for a mistake I didn't make. Because when someone chooses to cheat, it's not about the other person, it's about themselves. It's about the hole they can't fill with true love, and seek to fill with empty adventures. And she, as much as she tried to hide it, knew it. She knew what she was risking. She knew what she was losing. Weeks later, she came to me. Her eyes were puffy, her face drawn. She said she'd made a mistake. That the man she'd gone out with wasn't serious, that he was just looking for moments. She said she thought about me every night. That she missed me. That she wanted to come back. But time doesn't come back. And love, when broken, sometimes becomes too much shard to rebuild. I listened calmly. I didn't yell. I didn't humiliate her. I didn't question her. I just said what I needed to, I forgive you. But what we lived through is in the past. And I saw her eyes fill with a silent desperation, like someone who sees the train leaving and realizes they've stayed at the station. Too late. What she didn't know, and perhaps I never imagined would happen, is that I was no longer alone. And no, it wasn't about revenge, about replacement, about filling the void with anything. It was something else. An unexpected reunion. Someone who had been close for years, but whom my eyes couldn't see, too busy trying to save something that was already dead. It was an old, gentle, sincere love. A friendship that matured like wine. And one day, effortlessly, she smiled at me in a way no one else did. And I knew it was there. In the serenity of her eyes. In the comfortable silence. In the respect that overflowed with every gesture. It wasn't impulsive passion, it was mature love. The kind that doesn't need to promise eternity, because it lives intensely in the now. While the old woman tried to rescue what she destroyed, I was learning to love again. To trust again. To believe that, despite the betrayal, love was still possible, just in a different place. In a different lap. In a different time. The new woman made no promises. She didn't swear eternal fidelity. But she never gave me reason to doubt. She arrived slowly, unhurriedly, and rebuilt what the previous one had destroyed. And that was the biggest turning point in my life. Because when his ex-wife returned, she didn't find a broken man begging for reconciliation. She found someone whole. And that was true revenge, not coldness, not contempt, but peace. Because nothing hurts someone who betrayed you more than seeing you move on without her. That you rebuilt what she broke, and built something better. The curious thing is that, in all this chaos, I never sought revenge. Only dignity. I never wished her to suffer. But life has a peculiar way of showing what's truly valuable. And today, when she looks at me, she knows she lost. And when I look at her, I see no anger. Only gratitude. Because it was her betrayal that freed me to experience the love I deserved. But what makes this story truly unexpected, something no one could have ever imagined, is what happened when I met this woman again, who had always been there, in the shadows, silent, waiting for me to see. The moment I realized that fate, however cruel it may seem, is sometimes just trying to redirect us. And it was in that reunion, so banal and yet so grand, that everything changed. Because it wasn't just a new love, it was the revelation of something much greater. Something that had always been hidden between the lines of my own story. Something that only those who stay until the end will truly understand. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear, we do not support, romanticize, and never justify any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a brutal truth, that cheating destroys homes, breaks trust and costs true love. Our purpose is one, show, through fiction, the real price of a wrong choice. Prepare yourself. What you are about to hear, it's not just a story of love and loss. It's a lesson. It's a shock. It's reality dressed as drama. Settle in. Take a deep breath. The story will begin. In a city where the seasons seemed to obey the people's moods, a couple built, brick by brick, a story that seemed to have been crafted with patient hands. Her name was Emily, his was Daniel. They had met one spring afternoon at the cafe where she worked on weekends while finishing her literature degree. Daniel, a civil engineer, was discreet and soft-spoken, but there was something in the way he observed the world, as if always searching for the details no one else noticed, that immediately attracted Emily. Their first encounter was unpretentious, almost silent, and perhaps it was precisely this lack of haste that gave their beginning the texture of something destined to last. It wasn't love at first sight, but a slow build, like a song that starts softly and deepens with each chord. During their first meetings, they talked about books, architecture, 70s music, and the shared fear of living a shallow life. Emily said she felt suffocated in relationships that didn't challenge her mind. Daniel just smiled, as if he understood without needing to respond. They both had different backgrounds, but a similar emptiness in their hearts that they didn't express aloud. She had grown up with absent parents, seeking in words the stability she couldn't find in their embrace. He, raised by his grandmother after losing his parents at a young age, carried a sense of responsibility that made him seem older than his years. They were, in a way, two broken halves that fit together effortlessly, like puzzle pieces with worn edges but still fitting together. Over time, their routine as a couple turned into a daily life for three, he, she, and the feeling that they had finally found a home outside of their house. Dinners were simple, often improvised, but there was always wine, laughter, and that way of looking that only truly connected couples share. Friends saw them as a role model, an example of a love that matures without losing its sparkle. They had small rituals, lazy Sundays with coffee in bed, hidden messages in books, and the tradition of dining out every first Friday of the month, regardless of the rush of work. It wasn't a fairy tale, but a reality filled with intention and care. Daniel was observant. He could tell when she came home tired from work just by the way she threw her keys on the counter. Emily, on the other hand, knew his silences like no one else. She knew when he was tense before a presentation or frustrated with a project. They had both learned to respect each other's space, something rare in many relationships. Their love was mature, conscious, but there was still room for spontaneity. Once, he came home with flowers simply because he saw a woman smile as she received a bouquet on the street and thought she deserved that smile too. And she, on a random Tuesday morning, wrote, "I love you," on the bathroom mirror in red lipstick. Nothing grand, but sincere. His family adored her. Daniel's sister said she'd never seen him so centered and relaxed at the same time. Childhood friends, upon meeting her, commented on how he'd changed, and for the better. She made him laugh. She made him allow himself to dream about things beyond calculations and spreadsheets. Emily, in turn, told her friends that she felt safe with him. That, even in silence, she knew she was loved. That Daniel made her feel important, wanted, and heard. When they decided to live together, there was no formal proposal or ceremony. It was a natural choice, like someone deciding to breathe when their lungs are crying out for air. The apartment they shared was small but full of life. The walls were hung with pictures of quotes she loved, and the shelves were filled with plants he watered with dedication. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fresh bread, and the bed, even on difficult days, was always the meeting place for reconciliation. They fought, of course. They disagreed over trivial matters and, sometimes, on serious matters. But there was respect. There was always that moment when one of them took a deep breath and said, "Shall we talk?" This, perhaps, was the most beautiful thing between them, the daily choice to not let pride get the better of them. Emily dreamed of writing a book. Daniel, though he didn't say it out loud, dreamed of building a home from scratch for the two of them. A home where they could grow old. And these dreams, though different, walked hand in hand. She wrote in the late afternoon, he designed at night. They shared plans, drafts, fears, and ideas. They were accomplices, partners, and lovers. On birthdays, they didn't give each other expensive gifts. They wrote letters. Long letters, full of memories, promises, and affection. They were still far from being officially married, but everyone around them knew it was more solid than many marriages with a wedding ring on their finger. Over time, however, something began to change. Nothing blatant. Nothing blatant. Just small signs that are only noticed when the silence stretches on too long. Emily started working later. She said she needed to meet deadlines, finish projects. Daniel, meanwhile, immersed himself in a new contract, building a school in a remote neighborhood. Their meetings decreased. The messages became shorter. The Friday ritual was postponed once, twice, 3 times. But neither of them pointed out the problem. It was as if they were both waiting for the other to pull the brakes. Or perhaps they believed it was just a phase, and that it would pass. The connection, once so strong, began to waver. Sometimes they were together in the same room, but as distant as strangers on a bus. Daniel tried, with subtle gestures, to reconnect. He cooked her favorite meal, bought books he thought she would like. Emily thanked him, but her gaze always seemed to be elsewhere. There was no contempt. There was no indifference. There was absence. An absence that hurt because it had no form or name. It was like an echo that spread through the corners of the house, making the silence seem heavier than ever. Still, Daniel believed. He believed they were just going through a rough patch. That they would soon return to their original rhythm. That every couple goes through ups and downs. And Emily, even with her distant gaze, said she still loved him. She said it quietly, but she said it. And he clung to those words like a castaway on a piece of wood. Because love, for Daniel, wasn't just feeling, it was caring. It was staying. It was resisting when everything told him to run away. That's why he didn't question it. He didn't demand it. He just waited. Back then, she seemed more thoughtful. He spent more time on his cell phone. He received messages late at night, but he said they were from coworkers. Daniel wasn't the suspicious type. He never was. He always believed that trust was the foundation of any relationship. And trust, for him, meant freedom. It meant allowing the other person to be whole, even outside the relationship. Maybe that's why he didn't see what was coming. Or maybe you saw it and chose not to. Because sometimes, when you love deeply, you pretend you don't see it. You pretend it doesn't hurt. You pretend it's just a phase. Daniel was that kind of man. A man who preferred to believe in the best. Who preferred to fight rather than give up. Who preferred to rebuild rather than abandon. And so he held on, believing that love was still there, even if hidden. Even if tucked away in some corner of her heart. And perhaps that's why no one, not even him, could have predicted what was about to happen. Or how that special couples party would change forever. The invitation to the special couples party arrived in a simple envelope, but it held a significance Daniel couldn't immediately explain. It was organized by close friends, an event celebrating the union, the memories, and the commitments each couple had built over the years. To him, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to reconnect with Emily, to recapture the quiet glow that had seemed to fade within her over the past few months. He watched her fondly as she read the invitation, and for a moment, he thought he saw the enthusiasm he so desired in her eyes, but soon her expression became neutral, almost rehearsed. Still, she agreed to go, saying it might be good to break out of her routine for a bit. The days leading up to the event were filled with silent anticipation. Daniel bought a new tie, tried to keep the mood light at home, and even suggested they dance together in the middle of the living room, jokingly, as a rehearsal. Emily smiled, but it was a restrained, distant smile, as if she were participating in the scene only to avoid disappointing him. Deep down, he sensed something stirring behind that look. A shadow he couldn't name, but which was always there, accompanying them even in the simplest moments. On the night of the party, as she was getting dressed, Daniel watched her. Emily wore a red dress he'd never seen before, elegant, emphasizing her every feature in a way that left him speechless. Her loose hair fell over her shoulders like a perfect frame, and for a moment he felt like he was seeing her for the first time. But the detail that struck him most was that, upon noticing his gaze, she looked away, avoiding getting lost in it. It wasn't embarrassment, nor shyness. It was as if she didn't truly want to be seen. The room was illuminated by golden lights, with carefully decorated tables, glasses glinting in the reflection of the chandeliers, and soft music filling the space. Couples laughed, toasted, and exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Daniel held Emily's hand, but she felt cold and distant. He made a point of smiling at his friends, of appearing whole, but inside, he was restless. Something about that night seemed to be heading toward a point of no return, and even without knowing what it was, he couldn't shake the feeling. During the party, Emily chatted with other people, but there was a rush in her gestures, an impatience hidden beneath the surface. Daniel tried to spark conversation, funny memories, even future plans, but her answers were short. At one point, she said she was going to the bathroom. He nodded, unsuspecting, believing she'd be back soon. But time began to drag. First 5 minutes, then 10. Daniel looked around, trying not to show discomfort, until he decided to get up and discreetly look for it. It was then that everything changed. In the side hallway that led to the back of the room, he saw her. She wasn't alone. She was walking quickly alongside a man he'd never seen before, her steps determined, as if she didn't want to be noticed. Daniel's heart raced in a way he hadn't remembered feeling since adolescence, but not from shyness or passion. It was a tight, violent thud that seemed to rip the air from his lungs. He approached without thinking, the cold floor beneath his feet weighing like iron, and when he reached her, Emily finally saw him. Her look wasn't one of surprise. There wasn't the shock one expects when someone is caught red-handed. It was a low, almost resigned look, as if someone had already known this moment would come. Daniel was silent for a few seconds that seemed eternal. The world around him faded. There was no more music, no more voices, no more glow from the hall. Just her, the stranger beside her, and the truth laid bare in the scene before him. He didn't ask anything. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't beg for answers. He simply said, in a firm voice, heavy with a weight that didn't require shouting, "You just walked out of our story." Emily didn't answer. Her silence was the cruelest confirmation he could receive. There was no defense, no immediate regret. Just a look of averted eyes that said it all. The man beside her remained silent, like an extra in a drama that no longer needed words. Daniel took a deep breath, turned his back, and returned to the room. He walked between the tables as if nothing had happened, as if he still had the strength to maintain his dignity. He smiled discreetly at an acquaintance who offered him a glass of wine, raised the glass in a solitary toast, and sat down, while inside, a silent storm tore at every part of him. Emily, for her part, walked straight through the back doors, without looking back. And in that moment, something shattered forever. It wasn't just trust, nor just love. It was their very story that fell apart before Daniel's eyes, like pages torn from an unfinished book. He knew nothing would ever be the same again. I knew that night would be remembered as the dividing line between before and after. As the party continued, couples danced, toasted, and celebrated. But for Daniel, time had stopped. He no longer got up to dance, no longer sought conversation, no longer tried to hide the weight he carried within his chest. He simply stood there, his posture erect, his gaze fixed, and his heart shattered. And in that inner silence, a certainty grew: it wasn't he who had lost, but her. Because in that hasty choice, in that escape through the back door, Emily had left behind not just a man, but an entire life she had built, an entire love that would never be equaled. The secret, however, had not yet been revealed. The betrayal was exposed, naked, impossible to deny. But there was something else, something that still remained hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to come to light. And when it did, it would not only change the way Daniel viewed that night, but would rewrite the meaning of the entire story. The weeks following the party seemed to unfold in slow motion. Daniel maintained his routine with almost surgical precision. He woke up early, ran around the block, drank the same bitter coffee, reviewed projects with forced concentration, and returned home exhausted in body and broken soul. He avoided mentioning what had happened, and when anyone asked about Emily, he responded with short, respectful, but empty sentences. It was as if he needed to protect what was left of himself, to prevent the pitying gaze of others from opening wounds he was trying to cauterize internally. He never spoke ill of her, never made a fuss in public. But his silence said it all. She, on the other hand, disappeared. She vanished from social life, from social networks, from shared circles. No explanation, no attempt at contact. It was as if she'd evaporated, or perhaps she was simply running from the consequences of her choice. Daniel didn't pursue her, and not out of pride. But because, deep down, he knew that if he gave any room for justification, if he allowed even the slightest opening for her return, he would jeopardize the only thing he was still trying to preserve, his peace. It was then, on a rainy Saturday, as he entered a coffee shop to shelter from the sudden storm, that he saw someone he hadn't seen in years. Sitting alone at a corner table, fiddling with her phone with a half-drunk coffee in front of her, was Claire. They had met years ago, back in college. They were friends for a brief but intense time. They exchanged confidences, studied together, laughed like teenagers, until life took them on different paths. Claire always had a sweet but firm demeanor. Her gaze was serene, but it spoke volumes. When her eyes met his that day, there was a moment of silent recognition that felt almost cinematic. She smiled in surprise, and he returned it with a smile he hadn't given in a long time. The reunion was natural. They talked for over an hour, ignoring the outside world. Claire had recently returned to the city after living abroad, working in graphic design, and was still the same, just more mature, more confident. Daniel felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. There were no innuendos, no forced nostalgia. Just a good conversation, between people who recognized each other. They met again a few days later, and a few days after that, and soon they were almost constantly present in each other's lives. But it wasn't an escape, nor a lack. It was different. Claire wasn't filling a hole, she was illuminating a space Daniel thought had been destroyed forever. It was around this same time that Emily reappeared. A short email, saying she needed to talk. Daniel hesitated, but accepted. Not out of hope, but out of respect for their shared history. The meeting took place on a park bench, under a cloudy sky. Emily looked thinner, her hair tied back, her makeup poorly applied. Her eyes, once full of certainty, were now confused. She didn't apologize right away. She explained that her relationship with the man she left with ended shortly after the party. She said he wasn't who he seemed, that he walked away as soon as he got what he wanted. That she felt alone. That she made a mistake. That she regretted it. Daniel listened silently, without looking away. When she finished, he took a deep breath and said he forgave her. That he held no hatred or resentment. But that their time had passed. And that he was elsewhere now. Emily lowered her eyes, but didn't press. She simply said she had something else to tell him. And then she hesitated. She took a deep breath. She told him it wouldn't change anything, but that he deserved to know. Daniel didn't answer, just waited. And then, her voice trembling, she began. The night of the party, before deciding to go out with the other man, Emily had called Claire. Yes, the same Claire Daniel was now reuniting with. The two had never been close, but they followed each other online and had some acquaintances in common. Emily knew Claire had always harbored feelings for Daniel, even if they had never materialized in the past. That day, overcome by insecurity and a restlessness she couldn't even name, Emily acted cruelly. She called Claire, saying she still loved Daniel, that they were stronger than ever, and they would soon be engaged. He subtly asked Claire to stay away from him. He used sweet but sharp words, insinuating that Daniel didn't deserve to be involved in any kind of triangle, that he needed peace, and that Claire, getting closer, would only bring trouble. Claire, believing the call was sincere, deleted Daniel's number and decided to walk away. Out of respect. Because she didn't want to be the third person in anyone's story. And that's why, that very night, Emily felt free to leave through the back door. Because, manipulatively, she tried to ensure there would be no one there to greet Daniel when she left. It was a deliberate, planned choice that wasn't just a physical betrayal, it was an attempt to ensure he wouldn't get a second chance. That, by losing her, he would also lose any chance of reuniting with another woman who could truly love him. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting. His heart was racing, but his face remained motionless. Emily finished by saying she didn't know why she'd done it. Maybe it was fear. Fear that by losing Daniel, he'd find something better. And now that this was happening, she felt crushed by her own guilt. She apologized, this time with tears in her eyes, saying she understood if he never wanted to look at her again. Daniel was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm but filled with pain. He said he understood everything now. That he could finally put the pieces of the puzzle together. That Claire's sudden disappearance years ago had always left him confused. That he never expected someone who had shared his life with him for so long to be capable of manipulating even his possible future. He said he forgave her, because carrying hatred would only weigh her down. But he would never forget. When they said goodbye, there was no hug. Just a curt, final wave. Emily walked away slowly, and Daniel remained seated, staring into space. He felt a whirlwind of things at once: anger, relief, sadness, indignation. But above all, he felt clarity. He finally understood that this story was over. And that, however painful it was, something new was emerging, not as consolation, but as merit. That same day, he texted Claire. He asked to meet. He needed to tell her something. He needed, for the first time, to tell her everything he'd kept hidden for so long. Because now, there were no more shadows between them. No more interference. And what came next would be real, clean, and true. Claire chose a secluded park, where the trees formed a kind of natural tunnel and the wind blew with the gentleness that only certain places can offer. It was early autumn, and the yellowing leaves danced across the ground as if celebrating the fall of all that was old, making way for the new. She arrived first, sat on a weathered wooden bench, and kept her eyes fixed on the people passing by in the distance, trying to contain the anxiety pulsing in her chest. She didn't know exactly what Daniel wanted to tell her, but there was something in the tone of the message he sent that afternoon that made her understand this wasn't just another reunion, it was a turning point. When he appeared, walking slowly, his hands in his coat pockets and a serious expression, Claire stood up reflexively, her heart racing without permission. His eyes met hers with a firmness that left her feeling a mixture of comfort and disconcertion. He stopped a few steps away and smiled faintly, a brief, restrained, but genuine smile. Claire didn't know whether to hug him or wait for him to say something first, but before she could decide, he leaned closer and said with an honesty that cut through the air around her, "I know about the call. I know what she said to you before that night. And I know why you walked away." Claire's breath hitched for a moment. She blinked several times, trying to understand if she was really hearing that. He continued, his voice softer now, but still firm, "She told me everything. That she sought you out. That she used manipulative words. That she tried to get you out of my way before she left mine." Claire put her hand to her mouth in surprise, and it took a few seconds to form a response. "Daniel. I swear, at the time I thought I was doing the right thing. I never wanted to interfere in your lives. I never wanted to be a problem. When she called me, I believed her. I thought you were happy, that you were building something solid. And even though it hurt, I would never try to destroy it." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on hers, without anger, without judgment. "I know. And maybe that's why all this hurts even more. Because I had no idea what she was up to. I thought you'd simply distanced yourself, that life had taken a different path. But now it all makes sense." Claire swallowed, looking away for a second, before looking back at him. "I spent so much time trying to forget you. Trying to erase any feelings I still had. And when I saw you in that coffee shop, I forced myself to believe it was just a casual encounter, but it wasn't. It never was. I still felt everything, Daniel." He approached, this time sitting beside her on the bench. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but charged. Full of truths that took too long to be spoken. "Claire, I felt it too. Ever since that day at the cafe, I knew something had returned. Not because of her absence. But because of you. The way you looked at me. The way you listened to me. How, even after so long, you still knew how to read me. You saw me even when I said nothing." She smiled, almost unintentionally, and for a moment, it seemed the air around them grew lighter. But there was still a barrier. Something unresolved. Claire knew this. So she took a deep breath and decided to go further. But what now, Daniel? What do we do with all this? Because, despite everything, there are still scars. There's still a recent, painful past between us. He ran his hands through his hair thoughtfully, staring at the leaves falling silently around him. I'm not going to lie. I'm still processing everything. The betrayal, the manipulation, the loss. But what I'm certain of is that what I experienced with her can no longer compare to what I'm feeling now with you. Because with you, there's no doubt. There's no fear. There's truth. Claire took his hand, and it wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a gesture of support, of welcome. So let's take it slow. Let's take care of each other. No rush. No pressure to make up for lost time. Just, presence. Daniel looked at her as if finally finding the balance between pain and hope. Yes. Let's go with truth. In the days that followed, contact between the two became more frequent. Unpretentious lunches, long phone conversations, evening walks without the need for grand declarations. The relationship that blossomed there was different. It had deeper roots, born from the recognition of the other's pain. It was a love that was fueled not by need, but by admiration. Daniel allowed himself to smile again, but now in a light, sincere way. Claire, in turn, seemed to blossom with each new encounter, as if she were finally being seen with the depth she had always desired. Emily, on the other hand, sank into silence. She'd learned from mutual friends that Daniel was getting closer to Claire, and though she had no right to comment, she felt the ground crumble once more. She tried to resist the temptation to send more messages, but the weight of guilt was unbearable. One night, impulsive and unarmed, she showed up in front of their old house. Daniel saw her from the gate and hesitated before leaving. Claire wasn't there that day. Emily seemed smaller, more fragile. Her eyes held the same desperation as when she'd confessed everything, but now there was something more, acceptance. She knew she'd lost. I didn't come to ask for anything, she said, before he could open his mouth. I just needed to see you one last time. To know you're okay. That you found someone who cares for you like I couldn't. Daniel crossed his arms, keeping a safe but not hostile distance. I'm okay, yes. But not because someone healed me. I needed to rebuild myself. What Claire brought was peace. Not a patch. Emily nodded, tears flowing freely. I wish I could go back in time. Not to change everything, but to not have been such a coward. To not have pushed you away from her before leaving. That was the worst part. And maybe that's what I'll have to carry for the rest of my life. Daniel moved just close enough for his words to be spoken clearly, but without offering comfort. What happened is irreversible. But your guilt doesn't have to be an eternal prison either. Learn from this. Use this pain to never repeat it again. She nodded silently. Then she turned and walked away. Without saying goodbye, without looking back. This was, finally, the last page of their story. And Daniel felt something strange. It wasn't hatred, nor relief. It was bitter gratitude. As cruel as it had been, it had all led him here. To that place where, for the first time, he could love without fear. At the end of that week, Claire was waiting for him, sitting in the garden of the local art museum, the same place they had first visited together after their reunion. She wore a simple blue dress and was reading a random book. When he arrived, she looked up, smiled, and held out her hand. Daniel sat beside her without saying anything, simply intertwining his fingers with hers, and for a few minutes, they stayed there, simply breathing in unison. No promises were made, but everything in their eyes said they were ready for whatever came. Because now, between them, there was room for love to grow uninterrupted. Daniel no longer believed in fairy tales. But he believed in truth. He believed that some stories must end so that others, more sincere, more human, can begin. And perhaps, in the end, true love isn't the kind that endures everything, but the kind that blossoms after everything falls apart. Claire and Daniel continued walking through a new field, where their steps were still careful but no longer weighed down by the debris of the past. Their presence became as natural as the air one breathes when one is at peace, and although there were marks left by previous stories, they didn't stop them from moving forward. On the contrary, they served as silent reminders of everything they didn't want to repeat. Their conversations became increasingly intimate, not just in the words exchanged, but in the shared silences. Claire had the rare gift of understanding when he needed to speak and when he simply needed to exist alongside someone who didn't demand it. Daniel, in turn, learned to listen more deeply, as if each sentence she spoke carried layers of meaning that deserved careful deciphering. The seasons changed slowly, and with them, the relationship changed too. The initial uncertainties gave way to real development, guided by daily choices, and no longer by illusions or empty promises. Daniel began to realize that the love growing there didn't come like a storm, but like a steady breeze. He no longer needed to prove anything, defend himself, or wonder if he was enough. With Claire, there was room to be whole, with flaws, fears, and even doubts. She didn't demand perfection, but commitment. And that was all he had to offer. Even as this new phase blossomed, the memory of what he'd experienced with Emily hadn't completely disappeared. There was a subtle shadow, not out of longing, but out of the awareness that it still somehow resonated with decisions that needed to be made. Emily had left not only the wound of betrayal but also practical consequences. There were documents, old projects, social ties that needed to be carefully dissolved. And it was in this context that Daniel found himself faced with a difficult dilemma: to finally sever all the ties that still bound him to the old relationship, even if it meant facing uncomfortable moments and exposing wounds in front of others who didn't even know what had happened. One such instance occurred when he was invited to dinner at the home of some old friends of the couple. It was an annual tradition, and he considered declining, but Claire, with her usual calm, encouraged him to go. Not to prove a point, but to close a cycle. Sometimes we need to return to some places, not to stay, but to leave through the front door, she said, her voice low and sure. Daniel knew she was right. And he did. Arriving at dinner, she noticed the surprised looks on some faces, the awkwardness on others. The questions didn't come directly, but they were there, lingering in the air, like a smoke no one dared to dispel. During the evening, a mutual friend gently pulled Daniel aside and asked what had really happened. "You two seemed so right for each other, everyone thought you were ready to get married." He took a deep breath, looked into her eyes, and said, with the calm of someone who has already healed from within, "Not everything that seems solid is free from cracks. And sometimes, the worst cracks are the ones we don't see from the outside." The answer provoked a silence that needed no further explanation. Daniel didn't expose Emily, didn't reveal details, didn't try to justify himself. He simply remained dignified, as he had promised himself. Leaving that night, he felt lighter. It was as if a door had been permanently locked. There was no longer any need for emotional visits to that past. It was time to let everything take its course. Meanwhile, Claire was also facing her own internal conflicts. As certain as she was of her feelings for Daniel, there was a part of her that still tried to understand why he hadn't seen her sooner. Why they had to go through so much, such circuitous paths, to find each other again. One afternoon, while they were walking through the old town, she gently broached the subject. "Have you ever wondered, if we would have worked out back then, if everything had happened differently?" Daniel took a while to answer. Not for lack of words, but because he understood the weight of the question. "Yes. Many times. But I also wonder if I would have been the right man for you back then. I was someone else. You were too. Maybe, if we had tried, we would have destroyed each other. Maybe we needed to go through what we went through to know exactly what we no longer want." Claire smiled, a certain relief in her eyes. "You're right. But I think it will take me a while to stop thinking about what could have been." He took her hand and, with the firmness of someone unafraid of time, replied, "As long as we know what we are now, the rest doesn't matter." In the following months, the two decided to travel together. A weekend away from it all, with no itinerary, no obligations. Just the two of us, in a cabin surrounded by mountains and silent trails. There, between campfires and hot coffee, they talked about the fears they still had, the scars that still throbbed on difficult nights, the fear that something so good could be fleeting. And there, amidst the absolute silence of the mountains, they made a pact. Not for eternity. But truly. They promised not to lie, not to shy away from difficult conversations, not to let the silence become an abyss. They promised, above all, not to repeat the same old story, not to tread on unexplored trails, not to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. Upon their return, Daniel decided to sell his old apartment. That house, as full of memories as it was no longer a home. It was a place of ghosts. Claire accompanied him on his final visit, and while he gathered his last belongings, she walked through the rooms as if respecting the other's past without invading it. When they reached the room he had once shared with Emily, he stopped at the window and said, "It was here that I understood that love is not invincible. And it was also here that I decided I deserved better." Claire approached, ran her fingers down his back, and simply replied, "You do." The pieces were finally falling into place. But, like every story that draws to a close, there was one final test. One final moment where everything could be put to the test. An unexpected event, the wedding of one of their mutual friends, where both Daniel and Emily had been invited. The invitation arrived with a restrained but clear impact. Claire looked at him and said, "I'll go with you. If you want. But only if you feel ready." Daniel took a few days to respond. Not out of fear of meeting Emily, but because he understood that this meeting would be the final line. The exact point where the cycle would close with everyone involved present. He decided he would go. Not as a way of showing victory, nor to prove he had overcome. But to be there with the woman he now shared his days with, at peace with what he had been through and convinced of what he had built. That wedding night, Claire wore a burgundy dress that contrasted with the lightness of her presence. Daniel, in a simple suit, walked beside her naturally. They were greeted, welcomed, and sat among other couples, smiling and chatting naturally. And then, amidst the guests, Daniel's eyes met Emily's. It was only a second. She was accompanied by a friend, smiled discreetly when she saw him, and simply waved. He waved back, and in that gesture was a silent farewell. There was no more pain. There was nothing left to resolve. The past was in its rightful place, behind. Claire held his hand under the table, and he squeezed it affectionately. They were ready for whatever came, and more than that, they were together by choice. Not for lack of alternatives, not for emotional comfort, but for clear-headed love. And as the bride and groom exchanged vows at the altar, Daniel looked at Claire and, in his mind, thanked her. Not just her, but the tortuous path that had brought him here. The pain that had taught him to recognize what he now had. But there was still something Claire didn't know. Something Daniel had carried with him since the moment Emily confessed what she'd done, and something he hadn't yet had the courage to share. A truth that could change everything, or further seal the love they were building. And that moment was coming. The weeks following their friend's wedding were like a warm breeze before the storm. Claire and Daniel eased back into their routine, without grand plans, but with a constancy that warmed the heart. It was a love built on the rhythm of presence, without artificial euphoria, but with real depth. Improvised lunches amid the rush of work, late nights sharing series and confidences, small gestures amid the chaos. He would make her coffee before he left, she would fold his shirt with a care only found in love. Nothing needed to be said all the time, they were in the time of silent trust. But Daniel knew there was something inside him that needed to be revealed. Something that wasn't just about the past, but about what they were building now. Ever since Emily told him about the phone call she'd made to Claire before the betrayal, he'd been carrying a dilemma that grew with each passing day. It wasn't guilt. It was conscience. He knew Claire deserved to know. She deserved to hear from him that, even without knowing it, she too had been used, manipulated, and kept from something that perhaps could have blossomed much earlier. It was a wound she hadn't even known existed, and therefore, still raw. And even though the revelation carried risks, he knew that truly loving someone required courage. The courage to be transparent, even when the fear of the outcome weighed like lead. It was on a cloudy Friday afternoon that he decided to tell her. Claire had prepared a simple dinner at home, and they were laughing about something silly they'd seen on social media. Daniel watched her through the laughter and thought about how strong, serene, and yet so vulnerable that woman was when she let her guard down. He approached, cleared the dishes from the table, and carried them to the sink. He stood there for a moment, silent, his hands resting on the counter. Claire approached from behind, hugging him from behind. She felt the stiffness in his body and knew something was coming. "Did something happen?" she asked, and he turned slowly, his eyes serious but calm. "Yes. And I need to tell you. I can't carry this alone anymore." She sat across from him, her elbows resting on the table, her gaze intent. Daniel took a deep breath before beginning, and when he spoke, he chose his words with the same care one uses to tread on broken glass. "The day of the party, before the betrayal happened, Emily called you. She said she still loved me. She said we were about to get engaged. She asked you to stay away from me. And you believed her." Claire didn't react immediately. She just blinked a few times, trying to place that information somewhere in her memory. "She told me you were happy. That you were about to take the next step. That she didn't want anyone to interfere. I never imagined it was manipulation." Daniel nodded unhurriedly. "She knew you had feelings for me. And somehow, she didn't want you to be a possibility. So she took you out of her way before she left mine. She did it to give herself freedom. But also to make sure I didn't have anyone waiting on the other side." Claire lowered her eyes for a moment. When she looked back at him, there was a mixture of pain and clarity. "And you only found out about that later, right?" He nodded lightly. "Yes. She told me the day she came to apologize. And I couldn't tell you at the time. I needed to understand what that meant. But now I understand. And I don't want to hide anything from you." Claire stood slowly, walked to the window, and stood there, arms crossed, staring at the streetlights. They were silent for long minutes, and Daniel respected that. He knew each second was a world taking shape in her head. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but there was a distinct lump in her throat. "This changes a lot. Not because I distrust you. But because it makes me relive everything I felt back then. I blamed myself. I thought I was intruding. That I was a threat. And I walked away carrying the guilt of a love I didn't live. And now I realize I was taken from your life without a chance to fight." Daniel approached calmly, touched her shoulder, and Claire turned, her eyes welling up. "I need time to process this. Just time. I'm not going to run away. But I need to process it." He nodded. He didn't try to argue, didn't ask for immediate understanding. He simply kissed her forehead and said tenderly, "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." That night, she slept at home. She texted him later saying she needed space to think, and he understood. And in the days that followed, the silence between them wasn't absence, it was pause. Daniel didn't insist, didn't pressure. He knew that forcing any reconciliation too soon would be unfair to everything they were building. But time passed slowly. The hours dragged on with the weight of an uncertainty he thought he had left behind. Claire, for her part, spent days alternating between anger and sadness. Not for Daniel, but for everything that had been stolen from her, the opportunities she missed, the choices that were manipulated without her realizing it. She began to relive each moment with new eyes. She reread old messages, remembered silences that now made sense, words spoken by Emily that seemed innocent but were poisoned with intent. And all of this made her wonder if it would be possible to move on with someone who carried not only the weight of her pain, but also the pain caused by another woman. After a week without direct contact, Claire reached out to him. She called, her voice firm, and asked to meet. She chose a new park, one they had never been to together before. When he arrived, she was sitting under a tree, a closed book beside her and a still warm cup of coffee in her hand. He approached slowly and sat down beside her without saying anything. Claire looked at him with an expression that was neither anger nor relief. It was the face of someone who had made up her mind. "I've been thinking a lot this past week. And as much as this story hurts me, as much as it stirred up places I thought I'd already healed, I can't let the actions of someone who couldn't deal with their own emptiness determine what I do with what I feel now. I have hurt, yes. But I have so much more love. And I don't want to give that up." Daniel looked at her as if witnessing something sacred. "Are you sure?" Claire smiled, her eyes still teary. "No. But no one loves for sure. We love with courage. And I'm choosing that." Daniel hugged her tightly, like someone returning home after a long time. And in that embrace, words became useless. Because everything that needed to be said was already implicit there. It was no longer about the past. It was about the present. About the decision to move forward, despite everything. And in that reunion, more than forgiveness, there was commitment. They were, finally, ready to rewrite the story that almost didn't happen. But which now, with all the previous chapters closed, could be written right. And yet, there was still one final gesture to be made. Something Daniel knew needed to happen. Not for Claire, not for Emily. But for himself. He needed to visit the place where it all ended. The party room. The same one where, months ago, he had watched his life change through the back doors. He passed by chance one day, walking down the street, and saw that another event was taking place that night. He asked permission to enter for a moment. The space was being prepared for a new celebration. Tables were being decorated, waiters were in training, flowers were being precisely positioned. Daniel walked to the back of the room, stopped in front of the door where Emily had left that night, and stood there for minutes. He touched the doorknob as if closing a wound. He smiled, his eyes brimming with tears, and said, quietly, only to himself, "Thank you." And he left. Through the front door. This time, in one piece. And that was it. Autumn had finally given way to winter, and with it came the longer nights, the cold that demanded shelter not only for the body but for the soul. And it was in this setting that Daniel's life reached a new level of peace. It wasn't the kind of silent, untouchable peace one often hopes to find after a great storm, but a real peace, earned, forged in the pain that had to be navigated. Daniel and Claire no longer sought a perfect love. What existed between them was a true love, with cracks that served as gateways to the light, with flaws that made them more human, more caring, more aware of the value of each step taken together. The house they now shared was not an escape from the past, but a home built with bricks of trust, founded on the freedom to be exactly who they were, without fear of judgment, without the obligation to appear invincible. One morning, waking to the sound of light rain beating against the window, Daniel watched Claire sleep beside him, her hair spread out on the pillow, her face serene. He felt an inner warmth that didn't come from the duvet, but from the certainty that, after all, he had found the love that didn't demand sacrifice. And there, lying, he thought about how everything could have been different, how life's winding paths sometimes lead to the right destinations, even when they seemed like dead-end mazes. But he also knew that peace wouldn't have the same value if he hadn't known the pain of losing her first. Claire, for her part, felt whole. Not because of what Daniel gave her, but because of what they had built together. What enchanted her most was not his constant presence, but the way he silently respected her, how his love was always action, not just words. In difficult times, he listened to her. On good days, he celebrated her. It was never about grandiosity, but about coherence. And with him, she could finally live without shrinking, without needing to prove her worth. The fear that once haunted her decisions gave way to the tranquility of being with someone who not only chose to stay, but chose to remain even on cloudy days. Emily, on the other hand, followed a very different path. After reuniting with Daniel and the revelation of her actions, she faced difficult months. She lost many friends, not because of the words Daniel never said, but because of the silences that left room for the truth to shine through. Her reputation, once built on well-groomed appearances, began to crumble. Little by little, she realized she had lost not only a partner but also the trust of those around her. The invitations disappeared, the looks changed, and even without anyone pointing the finger, she felt in every gesture the judgment that came not from the betrayal itself, but from the coldness with which she tried to control others' paths. He tried to get back on his feet, of course. He went back to school, dedicated himself to new professional projects, and underwent therapy, but there was a weight weighing on him that was difficult to carry. The pain that accompanied her wasn't just regret, but a bitter realization that, by trying to ensure Daniel wouldn't be happy with anyone after her, she'd ended up ensuring exactly the opposite. She watched from afar as he blossomed with another woman, saw the respect they built, the genuine look they exchanged, and that hurt more than any punishment imposed by others. And one day, standing in the mirror, she realized that her mistake wasn't just cheating, but using that betrayal as a weapon against the one who offered her the most love. Time passed, and at a local literary event, where Claire was invited to present an artistic project involving design and poetry, Emily, sitting in the back row, received a standing ovation at the end. No one understood who she was. She didn't bother to introduce herself or talk. She was there not for recognition, but for something greater, to accept what she had lost and, with humility, to admire what now belonged to someone else. She left silently, and that night she wrote in her journal something she might never have said aloud: "I tried to control the future, destroying the bridges that connected it to other possibilities. In the end, what I destroyed were my own chances." Years later, Daniel and Claire married in an intimate, outdoor event, with few guests and no ostentation. The vows were short but filled with truth. Daniel spoke of the power of rebuilding, of how he learned to be whole after being broken. Claire spoke of the love you choose every day, not just on good days. Among those present, faces were filled with emotion, and among those absent, only the silence of what has been overcome. In a symbolic gesture, at the end of the ceremony, they buried together a small wooden box containing old letters, pieces of stories that were part of their pain. Not to forget, but to seal. The past was no longer a threat. It was merely the soil that supported what came next. And so, what began with an abrupt and painful end ended in a new beginning, mature, profound, and real. Daniel was no longer the man who watched his wife walk out a glass door with another man. He was now the man who knew when to close a door, when to keep another open, and, above all, when to build a new one, with his own hands. Claire was no longer the woman who had once had to disappear out of respect. She was now the woman who remained, out of love and choice. Emily was no longer the woman admired at dinner parties. He was now someone who learned, the hard way, that when you break a heart that trusted you with everything, the consequences can echo for a lifetime. If you've made it this far, tell us what you thought of this story in the comments. What was the moment that touched you most? Do you think Daniel did the right thing by moving on? And Emily, did she deserve a second chance, or did she reap exactly what she sowed? If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue hearing stories that show how true love requires truth, commitment, and, above all, respect. This story is fiction, but the feelings it evokes are real. And let's take this lesson: betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys memories, futures, dreams, and sometimes even the most precious thing a person has, the trust of others and their own dignity. On this channel, we do not support, justify, or minimize any type of betrayal. Here, we believe that love is only love when there is loyalty. Until the next story. And remember, those who choose to walk out a door without thinking may not realize they'll never be invited back.